In the previous video, we covered the basics of classical conditioning. In this video, we now turn our attention to operant conditioning. Whereas classical conditioning is about pairing two stimuli in the environment, operant conditioning is about pairing voluntary behaviors with outcomes. The basic principle of operant conditioning is based on Thorndike's law of effect, which states that behaviors that have a satisfying outcome are more likely to be repeated, whereas behaviors that have an unsatisfying outcome are less likely to be repeated. In other words, if you do something and you get a good outcome, you're more likely to do that behavior again in the future. By comparison, if you do something and there is a negative outcome, you're probably not going to want to do that behavior again. It's a pretty straightforward, maybe even obvious observation, but Thorndike had the foresight to actually test his ideas and write them down. Building on Thorndike's work, V.F. Skinner further developed these ideas and gave us a useful terminology to talk about things that have either satisfying or unsatisfying outcomes. Specifically, in Skinner's terminology, a reinforcement is anything that makes a behavior more likely to occur again. For example, if you reward a young child for saying please by giving her the object that she asked for, then you are reinforcing that behavior and making it more likely that she will continue to say please again in the future. In contrast, a punishment is anything that makes a behavior less likely to be repeated in the future. For example, I have a cat named Clover who is adorable and very smart. Unfortunately, she also has a bad habit of jumping up on our kitchen countertops, which we'd like her not to do. I have a spray bottle that can spray water, and this doesn't hurt Clover at all, but it's a mildly unpleasant sensation that she doesn't enjoy. In theory, if I spray Clover whenever she gets on our kitchen counter, this should make it less likely that she'll keep doing that behavior again in the future. Skinner also distinguished between positive versus negative forms of punishments and reinforcements. Here, though, positive and negative do not mean good or bad. Rather, positive simply means that something was added, whereas negative means that something was taken away. So think of positive and negative more in terms of addition and subtraction rather than good versus bad. A positive reinforcement is when something good is added. For example, getting paid, getting your favorite candy bar, or receiving a smile from a friend would all be examples of positive reinforcers. Now we come to the psychology term that is perhaps the most misused in everyday language: negative reinforcement. It does not mean punishment. Remember, a reinforcer means that the behavior is more likely to occur again because it results in a satisfying outcome. Rather, negative here simply means that something was taken away. In this case, because the outcome is ultimately satisfying, negative reinforcement means that something aversive was removed. Returning to another example with my cat. After a couple days, her litter box gets a little bit stinky, causing me to empty it. This is an example of negative reinforcement. I clean the litter box, which is the behavior, and I receive a satisfying outcome, which is the removal of the stinky smell. So this makes it more likely that I'll keep doing that behavior again in the future. As another example from my own life, my mom worries every year about me getting the flu shot. She got the flu once and it was really horrible, and like a good mom, she never wants me to experience that. So every year, starting around October, she starts bugging me to get my flu shot. It seems like nearly every time we talk on the phone, she asks me if I've gotten it yet. To stop my mom's nagging, I usually do in fact get my flu shot every year. Again, in this instance, the behavior, getting a flu shot, is being reinforced or made more likely to be repeated because when I do the behavior, then there is an aversive stimulus, which is my mom's constant bugging me, that is taken away. Negative reinforcement may be a little tricky to get the hang of at first because it does start with something aversive that is present. However, the key is that the aversive stimulus is removed, which ultimately serves to reward or reinforce the particular behavior. There are also positive and negative forms of punishment. Positive punishment means that something bad is added. The example that I mentioned earlier about using a water spray bottle with my cat is an example of positive punishment. Getting a spanking or getting yelled at are other forms of positive punishment. Negative punishment, in contrast, is when something good is taken away. Losing any form of privilege, like losing your car keys or losing out on TV time or being put in timeout, are all forms of negative punishment. Let's pause for an application practice question. Carl is trying to quit smoking but is having a hard time with withdrawal symptoms. Every time Carl smokes, it relieves his symptoms of withdrawal, and this motivates him to keep smoking more. This is an example of which operant conditioning principle? The correct answer is B, negative reinforcement. In this case, something bad, which is the withdrawal symptoms, was removed every time Carl smoked. So this ultimately reinforced his smoking behavior. That is, it made it more likely to occur again. Remember that positive and negative don't mean good or bad. They simply refer to whether something is added or taken away. And in this case, since something bad was being taken away, then that means that the smoking behavior is being negatively reinforced. Additionally, reinforcement and punishment refer to whether a behavior is more or less likely to occur again, even if it's a behavior that we actually don't want to do. And this is something that's really important to keep in mind, both for ourselves and for raising little humans and pets. For example, my parents' dog Poppy loves to steal shoes and other items that she knows she is not supposed to have. My parents will then give her a treat to try to encourage her to drop the item. When I am home visiting, I always remind them that they are actually positively reinforcing this unwanted behavior. If Poppy knows that she will get a treat and some attention every time she steals a shoe, then this is just going to motivate her to do the behavior even more. Although sometimes operant conditioning principles can lead to unintended consequences, many times people might use the principles of reinforcement to bring about a desired outcome. For example, if you have a dog and you want to teach it a trick like sit, you'll probably want to reinforce that behavior, for example, by giving him a treat. When you were first training your dog, maybe you gave him a treat every single time he obeyed your command to sit. This is called a continuous schedule of reinforcement. However, over time, maybe you stopped rewarding the behavior every single time. When we reward a behavior sometimes, but not always, this is called a partial schedule of reinforcement. And there are also 4 different types of partial reinforcement schedules, representing the cross between 2 main dimensions. First, a reinforcement schedule could either be fixed or variable. In a fixed schedule, the timing of the reward is always the same and thus predictable. In a variable schedule, it's not. Second, a reinforcement schedule could be based on either the number of responses, called ratio schedules, or it could be based on a duration of how long the behavior is being continuously performed, called interval schedules. Crossing these 2 dimensions creates 4 different partial reinforcement schedules: fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, and variable interval. Let's look now more at each one. First, a fixed ratio schedule of reinforcement means that you are rewarded for every certain number of times that you perform a behavior. A store rewards promotion like this one, where buying 9 cups of coffee gets you an additional 10th cup for free, is an example of a fixed ratio schedule. The behavior that is trying to be reinforced, which is buying coffee at that particular establishment, is rewarded with a free beverage every 9 times you complete the behavior. Thus, this is a ratio schedule because it is based on the number of times you do the behavior, and the ratio is fixed. You know ahead of time that you need to do the behavior exactly 9 times in order to get the reward. In a variable ratio schedule, you are still rewarded based on the number of responses or the number of times you perform a behavior. However, because the schedule is variable, the timing of the reward is no longer fixed or predictable. Instead, you might be rewarded for performing the behavior on average a certain number of times, but you never know for certain when a reward is coming. A slot machine is an example of a variable ratio schedule of reinforcement. In this case, the desired behavior, at least from the casino's perspective, is putting a quarter in the machine and playing the game. The slot machine is designed to pay out a certain number of times on average. However, there's no predicting exactly when a reward is coming. In theory, you could get a payout twice in a row, or you could play hundreds of games in a row without a dime to show for it. Moving on to interval schedules. On a fixed interval schedule, you are rewarded based on performing the behavior for a certain length of time. Again, because the schedule is fixed, you know exactly how long you need to perform the behavior in order to get a reward. An hourly wage employee is an example of a fixed interval schedule. The employee is paid a certain amount, say $14 or $15, for every hour that she spends continuously working. The schedule is also fixed. The employee knows exactly when a reward is coming. Finally, a variable interval schedule is when you are rewarded for performing a behavior for a certain length of time on average. But like a variable ratio schedule, you never know exactly when a reward is coming. Phone notifications are an example of a variable interval schedule of reinforcement. Depending on how active you and your friends are on social media or text messaging, you might get a notification, say, every 20 minutes or so on average. However, the timing of each notification is ultimately unpredictable. You might get a lot of notifications at once, or you could go a whole day without hearing from your friends. Different reinforcement schedules also come with different advantages and disadvantages. In terms of simple behavioral output, variable ratio schedules tend to produce the highest amount of responses, while fixed interval schedules tend to produce the lowest, as you can see here in this graph. Additionally, it's no coincidence that the two examples of variable schedules that I mentioned earlier, gambling and checking notifications on your phone, are potentially addictive behaviors. This is because on a variable schedule, regardless of whether it's ratio or interval, people never know for sure when a reward is coming. This incentivizes the person to continue performing the behavior at a high level because, well, you never know. A reward might be coming just around the corner. Let's pause for a final application practice question. Imagine that Sophia is studying for a chemistry exam. In order to motivate herself, she decides to reward herself with a piece of chocolate for every hour that she spends continuously studying. Which schedule of reinforcement is Sophia using? The correct answer here is C, fixed interval. First, notice that Sophia is rewarding herself based on a length of time that she continuously does a particular behavior. This is what tells us that Sophia is using an interval schedule. Next, notice that this length of time is consistent. That is, she rewards herself every hour, so she knows exactly when a reward is coming. So that tells us that this is a fixed schedule. Together, that means that Sophia's reward schedule is a fixed interval. In this video, we covered the basics of operant conditioning. For the exam, you should be able to explain Thorndike's law of effect, define positive and negative reinforcement and punishment and identify each of them in an example, and define fixed ratio, fixed interval, and variable interval schedules of reinforcement and identify each in an example.